All right, welcome to our Erev Shabbat Perashat class. Welcome back to it. We've been on a little hiatus because of the holidays, and we are about to address Perashat Ahare Mot. And the question today is, what is the special status of blood in our lives? And the Torah throws it at us in a very, very, very emphatic way, as we're about to see. Let's get right to it and look in the midst of our parasha, which is highlighted by the service of Yom Kippur on the front end and the prohibition of various illicit relations on the back end, and a smattering of a few other mitzvot in the middle. And one of them is the prohibition of eating or drinking blood. So let's recite those Pesukim. Let's mention and realize and take notice of some nuances that really should create difficulties in our thinking and try to resolve. So Perashat Ahare Mot, if you're following, we're in Perek Yud Zayin, starting from Pasuk Yud. The Torah tells us as follows: V'ish ish mebet Yisrael umin hager agar betocham asher yochal kol dam. Any Jew who drinks, here says eat, but we know it's talking about drinking, devours, consumes blood. Right off the bat, there is what we'll call extreme terminology being used by the Torah. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Natati fanai, literally speaking, I'll put my face, I'll pay attention to, I will focus upon this person who consumes the blood. And what's his consequences? And I'm going to suffer the consequences and the punishment of karet, the serious punishment, which only physical capital punishment is more severe than it in the Torah, called karet. Next, Pasuk Aleph continues with somewhat of an explanation. Ki nefesh habasar badamhi, because a person's nefesh, life, soul, is in the blood. And I placed it on the altar to atone for you. Ki hadam hu banefesh yikaper, because it is blood, and with the soul, or in lieu of the soul, it will atone. This is, of course, referring to the fact that anytime any single korban, any offering, any sacrifice is offered onto the mizbeah, onto the altar, there is one, besides shahita, besides slaughtering, there is a part of the service that is common to all korbanot, and that is the sprinkling of the blood. There are different blood offerings, types of blood sprinklings, depending on the sacrifice. All of them are done, we're being told here and elsewhere, for kapara, for atonement. And Hashem says, because this is being used as a vehicle for atonement, do not consume it. Pasuk Yud Bet, Al ken amarti lebnei Israel, and therefore I exclaimed to the Jewish people, Kol nefesh mekem lo tochal dam, don't you dare consume any blood. He keeps mentioning the Gad, the convert or the stranger. Let's skip one pasuk to pasuk Yud Daled. Ki nefesh kol basar damo benafshohu. That's a little bit repetitive, doesn't it? Because the soul or being of every flesh, his blood is in his being. Va'amal bnei Israel. Therefore, I explained to the Jewish people, dam kol basar lo tochelu. Do not consume and drink the blood of any being. Ki nefesh kol basar damo hi kol ochelav yikaret. Again, because the being or the soul of every flesh is the blood, anyone who eats it will suffer the consequences of karet. Well, I think it's safe to say that it seems like there is some superfluous, redundant, repetitious terminology going on over here. It's one thing to have mizvot repeated, which we'll show in a moment, elsewhere in the Torah. And it's another thing sometimes to use a double terminology You see in the Torah sometimes ish, and other types of double terminologies. But here, in the very same location, what seems to be beating us over the head over and over again is this warning not to have blood. And therefore, that behooves us to try to delve and try to analyze. Now, albeit, there's certainly a distinction between those terminologies. There are slight nuances that we can differentiate with. The first term warns us that nefesh basar badamhu. The next two sound a little different. Nefesh kol basar damo benafsho. And the third one, nefesh kol basar damo hi. That requires analysis. Now, let's point out that this is not the first time we have been instructed about the prohibition of eating blood. First time was in Perashat Sav, in the book of Vayikra, in Perek Zayin, chapter 7, in Pesukim Kavav and Kav Zayin, it says, "V'chol dam lo tochelu, v'chol moshe lo tochelu, v'chol moshevotechem la'of v'lebehema." So that warns us specifically, whether it's a livestock, whether it's a bird, can't consume the blood. Again, the punishment, the consequences is karet. And nor is our parashat the last time, as we see again in the third time in the book of Devarim, Perashat Re'eh, we're told in Perek Yudbet, chapter 12, Pasuk Tezayin, Rak Hadam Lo Tochelu, don't drink, don't consume blood. And then afterwards in Pesukim, Kav Gimal and Kav Dalet, it says, Rak Hazah, you really have to strengthen yourself, L'bilti Achol Hadam, without eating it. Again, that's terminology, because your being, your soul is blood. And therefore don't have the being or the soul with the flesh. And the pasuk, two pasukim later, actually, in Kafeh, tells us, astounding. In order so that you may earn long life, don't eat blood. It's astounding. What does the prohibition and refraining from drinking, consuming blood have to do with long life? There's a lot of repetition over here. There are nuances and different terminologies, but all seemingly pointing at the same direction. And of course, this prohibition is not just for human blood, which is obvious, but is also for all types of animal blood. Whether we're talking about domesticated animals, we call them a behemah, which also has a prohibition of eating certain fats, or non-domesticating animals, call them hayot, which does not have the prohibition of fat, or afot, birds. All of these species, blood consummation is prohibited. Side note, from the Torah perspective, fish blood is permissible. But otherwise, it's an overriding prohibition. And can we point out the fact that the punishment seems a bit severe? Karet. Not only that, the way the Torah presents it, Kadosh Baruch Hu very rarely bears down so directly on someone for a given transgression. And here states, "V'natati fanai ba'ishahu." I'm going to take care of this guy. I'm focusing. I'm honing in on this person like a laser beam, and he will suffer the consequences. Sounds like a murderer almost. He just consumed part of an animal. So what we're going to try to present are a number of different opinions and theories of the prohibition of eating blood, but really explain whether with all of them, it comes down to something that I call status. And with that, perhaps we'll understand the severity and the terminology used. Now, we need to, first of all, disclaimer, we're not going to actually resolve in this class all the distinctions of the different terminologies. That would require everyone holding a chumash, perhaps using a separate demonstration with charting the different terminologies and trying to match the different theories to the different language usages in the Pesukim. That far, we're not going to go. But the concept and ideas we will attempt to tackle. And so let's talk about 3 levels of status within using the theories of the various mefarshim, the rishonim, and the commentators. The Ramban speaks about the fact that it's inappropriate for a living being to devour life. In Hebrew, he says, "En ra'ui leba'al nefesh shetochal nefesh." A living being should not devour another living being. And the reason is because life belongs to God. You have to acknowledge yourself as a creation and the fact that you are amongst other living beings and creations in this world. Of course, in the animal kingdom, there is plenty of survival of the fittest and they devour each other, but you're expected to acknowledge yourself as a being, vis-a-vis other living beings, and not it's inappropriate to devour another being. In fact, the Ramban makes sure to remind us of the history of the fact that from Adam Harishon until Noah, there was a prohibition of eating anything but growth from the ground. And even post-Mabul, post-flood, when Noah performed Shahitah, slaughtered an animal, offered it as a sacrifice, the animal itself was permitted only for the usages of man, but not for the sake of devouring it just yet, according to the Ramban, because that lesson he wanted to impart upon man, that's inappropriate to devour another being of mine. I'm creator, you are a creation. Not my creations devour other creations. Of course, later when Am Yisrael were given the Torah, we were given an appropriate set of instructions and protocol as to how to slaughter and then consume an animal. So let's first speak about our status as creations, as beings, as biriot among the other creations. Let's move now into another status. The Sefer HaChinuch, I'm sorry, first let's, talk about the Sefer HaChinuch. Sefer HaChinuch says that he calls it somewhat of a negative training, a negative reinforcement in the trait of achzariyut, which is cruelty. For a person to swallow something of another being that he himself relies upon, and he himself has it ingrained and infused in him as part of his own being, namely blood. Blood is the nourishment, blood is the life that is infused in us, and the perpetuation and the existence and the circulation of our blood being pumped by our heart throughout our body at every moment of our lives, literally has our lives hanging in the balance. For without that blood, we no longer survive. And therefore, for us to consume the blood of another being and not recognize and be sensitive to the fact that indeed this other being relies upon that blood just like I do, is ignoring the fact that we as human beings are expected in a higher status to have character and to practice sensitivity, and therefore the refraining from the consuming of blood of another being trains us as human beings to have sensitivity. And therefore, this sort of segues us to a status not just of a creation of God, but to a special creation of God, a creation that has expectancies at a higher standard, and that is to exercise certain traits, and here specifically training us about sensitivity and the lack of cruelty to other beings. And coupling with that is another perush, partly of the Ramban, and the Abad Banel echoes this, and that is that when you consume blood of another, you sort of consume the nature of another. It's the life of a behemah, let's say of a cow, and it's your life. And when you consume blood, your blood, so to speak, is combined with the blood of another being, and here an animal, and so to speak, the nature of that animal does become part of your physical makeup. And maybe that has an impression upon you. And maybe therefore the lifeblood, literally, of another being mixed with your lifeblood will end up causing some type of actual physical and then transformation of status of a human being that is perhaps a descending status, a deteriorating status. And therefore, please draw the line. Draw the line between you as a human being and others as inferior beings. And this, therefore, the second status that the prohibition of blood is bringing to light and making sure that remains at the tip of our conscience is our special status, not just as a creation, but as a human being, a Homo sapien, elevated over other creations. And that segues us into the most important status. Let's first mention the theory of the Rambam and the Moreh Nebuchim, that, as he often does, relates some mitzvot to having us refrain from Gentile cultures. And he informs us of the fact historically that certain Gentile cultures drank blood of animals in order to connect to, or perhaps draw from, what's called shedim, demons, that in terms of their thinking and their understanding of other worlds, metaphysical worlds, that these demons were able to prophesize. And if they could also engage in the same activity as those demons, which is nourishing themselves with blood, perhaps they felt they'll be able to prophesize as well. And so to deter us and separate us for such, you can say, somewhat of a paganistic practice, that Rambam says prohibition of blood. And that really gets us into speaking about the fact that we have a status of Am Yisrael, which is distinct. And therefore, the Emet Davar says something fascinating, and that is this blood is used on the altar, every single sacrifice for kapara, for atonement, really from the desire of sins. And because of that, it becomes what he calls a helek gaboa, a portion for the above, meaning, so to speak, the food of God, what God consumes, so to speak. We shouldn't be consuming what Kadosh Baruch Hu is consuming. That's not your meal. That's not your entree. It's not on your menu. Don't order it. It's exclusive to God's menu. Realize who you are vis-a-vis God in your special status of the people of God, which brings us to the final theory that we'll mention today, at least, another notion of the Ramban and the Abad Banel. And that is, as the Pesukim have told us, Pasuk Yud Aleph in our Perashat explicitly, that this blood is used as the vehicle of atonement. And the concept is that our source of life, our source of physical nourishment, is being in some way mimicked by the blood of another and being spilled. The blood of another life, which is a behemah, an animal, a bird, is being spilled on the altar for our atonement. We know this as to be a terminology in the Torah, nefesh tahat nafesh, a life for a life. Instead of what we would deserve because of our sinfulness, instead of our lifeblood, our source of life, our nourishment being attacked and suffering the consequences, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in his mercy and in his compassion, allowed for us, the special status Jewish nation, to attain atonement by substituting our being, our nefesh, our lifeblood, our souls, ourselves for another, and therefore spill that blood on the Mizbeach. And really, that takes blood to another level altogether. It's demonstrating our special status as Am Yisrael and our unique relationship vis-a-vis HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the opportunities that he affords us, the line we draw between us and him, and yet the constant connection that we have of him. Coming together from the status of a creation to the status of a human being, to the elevated status of the specially chosen and dignified and distinguished and prestigious nation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we see that blood really represents who we are, not just on this world as beings, but on this world as the people of God. And therefore, the Torah says, if you can't recognize who you are, if you can't self-identify, if you don't appreciate your identity, natati fanai ba'isha, ba'nefesh ha'ochelet et hadam. And the Targum Yonatan bin Uziel, the other Aramaic translation, says on that, and I'll just translate his Aramaic to Hebrew and then to English, and that is, I'm going to panai, as Rashi says, penai, which means clear out. I'm going to give myself some time to focus on a person like that. What type of person doesn't appreciate who he is and what his status is and his existence on this earth in this lifetime? You can't ignore who you are. You're a creation of God. You're also a human being, and which has Selem Elohim. And above all, you're a member of Am Yisrael with a special status and a very distinguished, prestigious, and fortunate relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. If you consume the blood, all that is being lost. Make sure to separate yourself from that, and thereby always keep in mind who you are and feel fortunate to have the status and identify as a human being and a member of the nation of Am Yisrael. Amen.